Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to settle in for the story of Frankie Carbone, the volatile enforcer immortalized in Goodfellas, the man who laughed too loud, trusted too easily, and vanished in one of the most chilling rumors in Mafia history. They say he was found frozen, locked inside a meat truck, left there as a warning to everyone who talked too much, moved too fast, or forgot their place. But here's the truth most people never hear. The real story behind Frankie Carbone is darker, quieter, and far more unsettling than Hollywood ever showed you. Before we begin, take a moment and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? We love watching this underworld stretch across countries, cities, and sleepless nights. And if you find yourself drawn to these stories, the ones that live between the headlines and the shadows, consider subscribing to Outlaw Icons. New documentaries arrive regularly, each one designed to be immersive, atmospheric, and faithful to the real history behind the legends. Now, take a slow breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. Lower the lights, and step carefully, because once you enter this story, not everyone makes it out. This is Outlaw Icons. Your Sleepy Dawn. Chapter 1. Brooklyn Before the Myth. The night doesn't begin with a gunshot. It begins with cold, the kind that seeps through steel and bone alike. A delivery truck sits silent, parked like it belongs there. No one looks twice. In this world, you never do. Somewhere inside, a man has already learned the final lesson of this life. That noise gets you noticed, and being noticed gets you erased. The myth will come later. The rumors, the movie scenes. But before any of that, before bodies vanish and names turn into warnings, there was a place, and a time, and a city that taught men how to survive long before it taught them how to kill. Brooklyn, the years after the war, smelled like oil, bread, and sweat. The air carried the weight of returning soldiers and unspoken disappointment. The men came home older than their years, with medals tucked into drawers and silence folded into their bones. Jobs were scarce, pride was fragile, and respect was everything. If you didn't have money, you had your name. And if you lost that, you had nothing left to trade. The streets were narrow and crowded, not just with people, but with memory. Italian voices spilled out of open windows, arguing about food, politics, and old villages across an ocean they might never see again. Mothers leaned out fire escapes, calling sons home before dark, knowing full well most of them wouldn't listen. Fathers stood on corners with hands in coat pockets, watching the block the way a farmer watches weather, always alert, always calculating what was coming next. This was not the Brooklyn of postcards. This was Brooklyn as a pressure cooker. Every block its own small country. Every stoop a border crossing. You learned early who belonged and who didn't. Who could walk freely and who needed permission, spoken or unspoken. The rules weren't written down, but they were enforced with absolute clarity. Queens was different, but not softer. It was where ambition stretched its legs, where men went when Brooklyn felt too small for their plans. Wider streets, new houses, the illusion of distance from the old world, even though the same codes followed you there, just quieter. Brooklyn taught you how to survive. Queens taught you how to expand without being seen. The rackets didn't announce themselves. They blended in, like termites inside the walls, working constantly, invisibly. Numbers slipped past hand to hand like folded prayers. Cash moved the way blood moves, unseen but essential. Small loans turned into lifelong obligations. A favor today became a debt tomorrow, and debts were the most reliable currency of all. To outsiders, it looked harmless. A few guys hanging around storefronts, a backroom card game, a truck that always seemed to get unloaded first. But beneath that surface was a living system, built on loyalty and fear in equal measure. Think of it like gravity. You didn't have to see it to feel it pulling you in. Young men grew up watching this, not studying it, absorbing it, learning which men never waited in line, which men spoke softly and were never interrupted, which men never seemed to work, yet always had money in their pockets and time on their hands. They noticed who the police spoke to respectfully, who the shopkeepers greeted with forced smiles, who never paid full price for anything. No one sat them down and explained it. That would have been dangerous. Instead, the lessons came through example, through what happened to people who broke the rhythm of the block. A man who complained too loudly, another who owed too much, someone who talked when silence was expected. One day they were there. The next day, they weren't. And no one asked questions because questions were invitations. There was pride in this world. Real pride. Not the kind you brag about, but the kind that keeps you standing when everything else is taken away. These men believed they were building something their fathers never had. Control. Security. A system where you didn't have to beg anyone for permission to exist. The law didn't protect them, so they built their own version of it. Flawed and brutal, but familiar. Fear lived here too, but it was worn like a jacket. You learned how to carry it without letting it slow you down. Fear made you careful. It made you listen more than you spoke. It made you notice the small things, the car idling too long, the face you didn't recognize, the sudden quiet when you entered a room. Violence wasn't constant. That's the part movies get wrong. It was rare enough to be unforgettable, like a storm that only comes once in a while, but when it does, it tears the roof off. Most days were about routine, about maintaining balance, about making sure money flowed and problems stayed small. In this ecosystem, reputation mattered more than strength. Being unpredictable was dangerous. Being reliable was power. The men who lasted weren't always the toughest. They were the ones who understood timing, who knew when to push and when to disappear, who could read a room the way a sailor reads waves. This was the soil that grew legends. But legends weren't born yet. Not really. These were just men, some nervous, some arrogant, some desperate to prove they belonged. They laughed too loud, drank too much, trusted the wrong people. Others learned to keep their faces still and their mouths shut, watching carefully, waiting for opportunity or disaster, whichever came first. The line between respect and exposure was thin. Too quiet, and people thought you were weak. Too loud, and they thought you were careless. Survival meant walking that line every single day, knowing one misstep could cost you everything. Families felt the tension, even if they never spoke about it. Wives learned not to ask certain questions. Children learned not to repeat what they heard at the dinner table. Love existed here, but it lived alongside secrets. You could care deeply for someone and still understand that their world might one day swallow them whole. And still, there was hope. Hope that this life would be temporary. That one good score or smart move could buy an exit. That maybe the next generation wouldn't have to stand on corners and learn these rules by watching men disappear. That hope kept people going, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. By the late 1950s, the system was fully formed. Not flashy, not chaotic, efficient, like a machine that didn't need fuel so long as men kept believing in it. And belief was easy when the streets rewarded loyalty and punished mistakes swiftly. No one talked about the future out loud. You didn't plan too far ahead. Planning assumed control, and control was an illusion. You focused on today, on this deal, this drive, this conversation. Tomorrow could wait. Somewhere in this maze of streets and codes, a certain kind of man began to take shape. Not yet a character, not yet a cautionary tale, just another face in the crowd, learning the same lessons everyone else learned, maybe a little faster, maybe a little louder. He would grow up surrounded by this rhythm, by men who measured worth in silence and survival, by a world that didn't forgive hesitation and never forgot disrespect. And one day, when the stories are told and retold, people will argue about what really happened, about whether the ending was justice or inevitability. But for now, none of that has happened yet. The streets are still alive. The trucks still run. The laughter still echoes out of social clubs late into the night. And the cold that will one day matter most hasn't arrived yet. It's coming, quietly, like everything else in this world. Chapter 2. The real man behind Frankie Carbone. He wasn't screaming when it happened. That's the first thing people get wrong. Men like this don't go out yelling or begging. By the time the end comes, they already understand the rules well enough to know there's no audience left to perform for. The shouting is for movies. Real life and quieter. And the man who would one day be remembered as Frankie Carbone learned that silence long before anyone ever whispered his name. Before the character existed, before the rumors hardened into folklore, there was just another kid moving through Brooklyn's tight corridors, watching carefully, absorbing everything. He didn't grow up dreaming of violence. None of them did. He grew up learning how to fit, how to survive in rooms where you were always being measured. Not with scales, but with glances, with pauses in conversation, with the way men looked at you when you spoke, and more importantly, when you didn't. The real man behind the myth wasn't a headline. He wasn't a legend. He was a street-level presence, the kind of guy you noticed only after he'd been around a while. The kind who didn't rush into conversations, didn't dominate tables, didn't act like he was auditioning for anything. That alone set him apart. In a world full of men trying to prove they mattered, restraint was its own signal. He came up in the cracks of the system. Not at the top, not even close. He learned the business the way most did, through errands that felt meaningless until you understood what they really were. Carrying messages, watching doors, sitting in cars longer than necessary, learning which questions not to ask. Every task was a test, even if no one said so out loud. What separated him wasn't intelligence or strength. It was temperament. He had the kind of personality that could sit still while chaos unfolded around him. That made people uneasy. Loud men were easy to read. Quiet ones made you wonder what they were thinking. In that environment, being underestimated could be useful. It bought you time. It bought you space. Violence entered his life early, but not the way outsiders imagine. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical. A tool, not a thrill. He saw what happened when people used it carelessly. How attention followed blood. How the wrong kind of reputation shortened lives. So he learned to keep his hands clean whenever possible, even when others around him didn't. The crews he moved with weren't glamorous. They were collections of men bound together by geography and necessity more than loyalty. Loyalty came later, if it came at all. At first, everyone was disposable. That was another lesson he learned quickly. If you wanted to last, you had to make yourself useful without making yourself obvious. He watched others burn bright and fast. Guys who talked too much, laughed too loud, acted like the street was a stage and they were the main attraction. Those men attracted attention from both sides. From law enforcement, from higher-ups who didn't appreciate unpredictability, from rivals looking to make a name. One by one, they disappeared, ended up locked away, or worse. And through it all, he stayed. Present but indistinct. The kind of man whose name didn't come up unless it needed to. The kind who could be trusted to handle things without improvising. That trust was earned slowly. A favor handled cleanly. A problem resolved quietly. A night where something could have gone wrong, but didn't. Hollywood would later compress all of this into a single personality. Loud, reckless, volatile. It made for good storytelling. But the real man wasn't built that way. He didn't see himself as fearless. He saw himself as careful. Fear was part of the equation. Anyone who said otherwise was lying. Fear sharpened him, made him attentive, made him cautious about who he spoke around and what he revealed. Money came in small amounts at first. Cash folded and passed quickly, never lingering. He learned early that money was less important than access. Access to rooms, to conversations, to people who could open doors or close them forever. He understood that the real currency wasn't cash, but discretion. There were moments when he could have walked away, times when the risks outweighed the rewards. But walking away wasn't as simple as it sounded. This world didn't have exits clearly marked. Once you were known, once you were useful, stepping back raised questions. Questions were dangerous. They suggested doubt. Doubt suggested weakness. So he stayed. And as he stayed, the expectations grew. Not dramatically, subtly. He was asked to be present more often, to handle things others didn't want attached to their names, to sit in on conversations where the tone shifted when he entered the room. These were not promotions in the traditional sense. They were invitations into deeper water. With deeper water came deeper consequences. He learned that mistakes weren't always punished immediately. Sometimes they were remembered instead, stored away until they could be used. A careless word, a wrong look, a moment of frustration. Nothing was ever forgotten. It just waited. The pressure of that knowledge weighed on everyone, but it weighed differently on him. He didn't crack outwardly. He internalized it, carried it with him. That internal pressure built over years, shaping his demeanor into something harder, sharper. People began to describe him as intense, not angry, focused, watching everything. This was where the seeds of the myth were planted, not in any single act of violence, but in the accumulation of presence. People began to associate him with outcomes. If he was involved, things got resolved. If he showed up, it meant the situation mattered. That association made him valuable, but it also made him visible in a way he couldn't fully control. Visibility is dangerous currency. The higher you rise, the less room you have to maneuver. He understood that, but he was already moving. Momentum has its own gravity. Once you're in motion, stopping becomes harder than continuing, even when you sense the edge approaching. The late 1960s and early 70s were changing the landscape. Law enforcement pressure increased. Informants became more common. Paranoia crept into every conversation. Trust, once scarce, became nearly extinct. Men began watching each other as closely as they watched outsiders. In that environment, personality flaws became liabilities. Impulsiveness wasn't just annoying. It was fatal. The real man behind Frankie Carbone wasn't reckless by nature, but he was human. He had moments of frustration, moments where the weight of constant caution pressed too hard. Those moments didn't go unnoticed. Whispers began circulating. Nothing concrete, just impressions, concerns, the kind of doubts that never get written down but spread anyway. Was he too tense? Too unpredictable under pressure? Did he know too much? Did he talk too freely when relaxed? No one accused him outright. Accusations were for amateurs. Professionals dealt in implication. An implication was enough. What makes this part uncomfortable is how ordinary it all was. There was no dramatic betrayal, no clear line crossed, just a gradual shift in how people looked at him. Less warmth, more distance, conversations that stopped a beat too early when he approached, invitations that stopped coming. He felt it. Of course he did. Everyone did when it happened to them. But acknowledging it was dangerous. Drawing attention to your own isolation only accelerated it. So he did what men in his position always did. He doubled down, stayed active, stayed present, tried to remind everyone why he was useful. That instinct, the urge to prove your value when it's questioned, is where the trap snaps shut. The harder you push, the more visible you become. The more visible you become, the easier it is for others to justify decisions about you. By the time the idea of removing him formed fully, it didn't feel dramatic to anyone involved. It felt procedural, like closing a loose end, like correcting an imbalance. That's how these things happen. Not with rage, but with consensus. Quiet nods, short conversations, decisions made without the person ever being in the room. The movie would later give him a name, a personality, a loud, unforgettable death. But the real story was already ending long before that. Ending in silence. Ending in glances exchanged behind closed doors. Ending in the cold calculation that this man, once useful, now represented risk. And risk was the one thing this world could never tolerate. The night he disappeared didn't come with warning sirens. No dramatic farewell. Just another evening that felt like every other until it wasn't. Somewhere, a decision had already been made. Somewhere, men were already adjusting their futures to account for his absence. By morning, his name would begin its slow transformation. From presence to question. From question to rumor. From rumor to legend. And somewhere down the line, someone would decide to freeze that legend in place. To turn a quiet disappearance into a story too vivid to forget. But that part comes later. For now, all that exists is uncertainty. A man who thought he understood the rules. A system that never stops rewriting them. And a silence spreading outward, filling the space where he used to be. Chapter 3. Inside the crew that made him. It always starts the same way. A room that feels smaller than it should. Cigarette smoke hanging low, like it's trying to listen. Men positioned just far enough apart that no one looks eager, but no one looks weak. This is where the real work happens. Not on the street, not in the violence, but here, in spaces where decisions are made without raising voices, where a nod can mean a future or the absence of one. The crew didn't feel like a crew when you first saw it. There were no uniforms, no formal structure that an outsider could recognize. It looked like a loose collection of men killing time, hanging around storefronts, leaning against cars, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. But beneath that casual surface was something tight and disciplined, held together by pressure rather than friendship. This was the environment that shaped him next. Not just the streets, but the machinery behind them. The crew operated like a living organism. Every man had a function, even if he didn't fully understand it. Some were visible, some were deliberately kept in the background, and the most dangerous ones were often the least obvious. He didn't walk into this world fully formed. No one does. He entered cautiously, feeling the edges before stepping all the way inside. At first, he was peripheral, present, but not central, close enough to observe, far enough to remain deniable. That distance was intentional. Crews didn't rush trust. Trust was built the way calluses formed, slowly, through repeated friction. The men at the center had already survived things he hadn't. Prison time, power struggles, losses that never made the papers. They carried themselves differently, not louder, calmer, like men who had already learned how quickly everything could disappear. They didn't explain the rules. They expected you to absorb them. And he did. He learned when to show up and when to stay away, when a problem was his responsibility and when it wasn't his place to intervene. He learned that curiosity was dangerous, that asking why was often worse than doing what you were told without explanation. The crew valued obedience, but it respected awareness. You had to understand what was happening without needing it spelled out. Money moved constantly, but it was rarely discussed directly. Cash appeared and disappeared the way tides did. Predictable if you paid attention, invisible if you didn't. Small rackets fed into larger ones. A card game here, a hijack load there. Loans extended quietly, collected firmly. Each operation overlapped with another, creating a web that was hard to trace and harder to dismantle. For the men inside it, this wasn't crime. It was infrastructure. It provided income where the legitimate world had failed. It offered protection where the law didn't reach. It rewarded loyalty and punished recklessness. That internal logic mattered more than legality. In their minds, they weren't predators. They were managers of chaos. He began taking on more responsibility without ceremony. No promotion announcements. No congratulations. Just an expectation that he'd handle certain things now. Deliver a message. Make sure a meeting stayed private. Apply pressure where pressure was needed, and restraint where restraint mattered more. Violence hovered over everything, but it wasn't constant. Most days passed without incident. That was by design. Violence was expensive. It attracted attention. It created ripples. The crew preferred solutions that left no marks. A conversation that ended with an understanding. A debt restructured. A person persuaded to relocate or rethink their priorities. When violence did happen, it was precise, controlled, over quickly, and everyone understood why it had happened without anyone having to explain it. That understanding reinforced the rules better than any speech ever could. Inside the crew, hierarchy wasn't shouted. It was sensed. You knew who mattered by who others deferred to, by who spoke last, by whose silence carried weight. He paid attention to that, not because he wanted to climb quickly, but because misreading the hierarchy was fatal. Some men wanted to be seen. They dressed louder, laughed harder, acted like presence itself was power. They mistook visibility for importance. The crew tolerated them as long as they were useful. When they became liabilities, tolerance ended. He wasn't like that. He didn't chase attention. He focused on execution, on being dependable, on becoming the person others relied on when things needed to be handled cleanly. That made him valuable, but it also made him visible in a different way. The crew began using him as a buffer. Someone who could interact with volatile personalities without escalating situations. Someone who could be trusted to keep his emotions in check when others couldn't. That role was subtle, but dangerous. Buffers absorb impact. They protect the core, but they take the hit. He felt the shift before anyone said anything. The way eyes turned toward him during tense moments. The way conversations paused, waiting for his reaction. That kind of attention isn't flattering. It's a warning. It means you're being measured not just for what you do, but for how you react under pressure. Pressure increased as the years went on. Law enforcement grew more aggressive. Informants became more common. Crews across the city were being squeezed, and everyone felt it. Meetings grew shorter. Trust narrowed. Decisions were made faster, with less discussion. The margin for error shrank. Inside that environment, the crew became less forgiving. Traits that were once manageable became unacceptable. Temper, anxiety, restlessness. Anything that suggested instability was scrutinized. The system didn't care about intentions, only outcomes. He tried to adapt. He stayed active, stayed present, made sure his usefulness was undeniable. But usefulness has an expiration date when it starts to overlap with risk. And risk, once associated with your name, is hard to shake. The crew talked about him without him knowing. Not maliciously at first. Just assessments. Observations. Is he solid? Is he getting jumpy? Does he know too much? Is he being watched? These questions floated around quietly, gaining weight with each repetition. No one asked him directly. That would have been cruel and unnecessary. By the time questions are asked openly, decisions are already made. The real conversations happen elsewhere, in rooms you're not invited into anymore. He sensed the distance growing, the subtle exclusions, the meetings that happened without him, the jobs assigned to others. None of it was dramatic. That's what made it terrifying. There was no clear accusation to defend against, no single moment to correct, just a slow fading. Crews don't like uncertainty. They don't like variables they can't control. And men who sense their own isolation often become unpredictable, even if they don't intend to. That unpredictability feeds the very fears that created the isolation in the first place. It's a closed loop. Once you're in it, escaping becomes nearly impossible. He still believed he could fix it. That one more successful job, one more demonstration of reliability, would restore confidence. That belief kept him moving forward when caution might have told him to step back. But stepping back would have raised its own questions. This is the part no one tells you about. There is no neutral ground. Doing nothing is as suspicious as doing too much. The crew expects momentum. They expect participation. Absence is interpreted as distance, and distance is dangerous. By the time the crew began quietly adjusting to the idea of life without him, he was still showing up, still trying, still believing there was space to recover lost ground. He didn't know that the math had already been done, that his name had already shifted categories in their minds. The machine doesn't announce when it's done with you. It just stops accommodating you. The myth would later portray him as reckless, loud, out of control. That made the ending feel inevitable. Clean. But the truth is more uncomfortable. He was neither hero nor fool. He was a man navigating a system that rewards control and punishes even the suggestion of instability. And the crew that once relied on him was already preparing for the silence his absence would create. He just didn't know it yet. Somewhere, a decision was approaching. Not with urgency, with patience, waiting for the right moment, the right excuse, the right alignment of circumstances. That's how these things end. Not in chaos, but in timing. And once the timing was right, the crew would do what crews always do. They would close ranks. They would protect themselves. And they would move on, leaving only a story behind, waiting to be told. Chapter 4. The Man Who Changed the Temperature. The first sign something had shifted wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was laughter. Too loud. Too relaxed. The kind that fills a room and lingers just long enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. The kind that tells you someone believes they're untouchable. That was when the temperature changed. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just enough that people started paying closer attention. Every crew has someone like this. A gravity well. A man whose presence bends everything around him. Conversations tilt. Decisions speed up. Risk feels smaller when he's nearby, even when it isn't. He didn't walk into rooms carefully. He owned them, or at least acted like he did. And in this world, acting like you own something long enough sometimes convinces others that you actually do. He was different from the rest. Not quieter, not more disciplined, louder, sharper, unafraid of chaos. Where others avoided attention, he leaned into it, treating risk like fuel instead of poison. He spoke quickly, laughed hard, and trusted his instincts more than caution ever would. Some men saw brilliance in that. Others saw a ticking clock. To those on the outside, he looked fearless. To those inside, he looked inevitable. He believed momentum could solve anything. That speed was protection. That if you moved fast enough, no one could catch you. Not rivals, not law enforcement, not even consequences. For a while, he was right. He didn't rise by being patient. He rose by being useful in a way no one else was willing to be. He took chances others wouldn't, handled problems others hesitated over, made decisions in moments when everyone else froze. That made him valuable. It also made him dangerous. When he entered the orbit of the crew, the balance shifted immediately. Meetings grew louder. Jobs grew bigger. The margins for error widened, but so did the rewards. Money flowed faster. Risk became normalized. People started talking about what they could do next instead of what they should avoid. For men who had spent their lives measuring every move, this was intoxicating. The possibility of expansion, of stepping beyond the old limits, of becoming something more than neighborhood operators. He promised a bigger future, not with speeches, but with action. And action is persuasive. For the man watching all of this unfold from closer than he should have been, it was both opportunity and threat. Opportunity because association brings protection. Threat because volatility spreads. And volatility doesn't discriminate. He admired the confidence. It was hard not to. There was something magnetic about someone who didn't seem afraid of the same things everyone else tiptoed around. But admiration came with unease. He could feel the rhythm changing, the pace accelerating beyond what felt sustainable. The crew began adjusting around this new force. Old rules bent. Some quietly broke. Lines that had once been clear blurred. Violence became less rare, not because it was necessary, but because it was easier. When problems were solved quickly and dramatically, subtlety started to feel slow. Not everyone was comfortable with that. Older men watched from the edges, saying little. They had seen this pattern before. They knew what happened when speed replaced discipline, when ego outran structure. But they also understood something else. You don't stop momentum by opposing it directly. You either ride it or wait for it to burn itself out. And burn it did. Slowly at first, then all at once. The man who brought the heat didn't notice the shift until it was already underway. He mistook tolerance for approval, laughter for loyalty. He believed success insulated him from consequences. That belief made him careless in ways that mattered. He talked too freely, trusted too broadly. He believed his reputation preceded him everywhere, that fear alone would keep things in line. But fear has a shelf life. It dulls with repetition, especially when it isn't backed by restraint. Law enforcement noticed the noise. Rivals noticed the expansion. And within the crew, something else happened. The quiet men started pulling back, creating distance, letting him take center stage while they repositioned themselves in the background. For the man caught between worlds, this was dangerous territory. Proximity to power brings visibility. Visibility brings scrutiny. And scrutiny rarely stops with one person. When a spotlight turns on, it doesn't isolate. It spreads. He found himself closer to the heat than he wanted to be. Not because he sought it, but because he had been useful during its rise. He had handled things, smoothed edges, contained fallout. That made him associated with the new order, whether he liked it or not. Association is sticky. It clings to you even when you try to shake it off. As the temperature rose, so did paranoia. Meetings became tense. Trust narrowed further. Everyone started watching everyone else, not just for betrayal, but for weakness. Weakness could be exploited or eliminated. The man who brought the chaos thrived in this environment, at least outwardly. He moved faster, took bigger risks, pushed harder. He believed pressure revealed truth, that if people cracked, they deserved to be exposed. It was a philosophy built on dominance, not sustainability. For a while it worked. The crew expanded. Money poured in. Influence grew. And the old warnings were ignored. Success has a way of silencing caution. But beneath the surface, the cracks widened. Mistakes multiplied. Small errors that once would have been corrected quietly now echoed loudly. People got sloppy, loose and piled up, and the cost of cleaning them grew higher each time. The man watching this understood the danger. He could feel in the air, in the way conversations stopped abruptly when certain names came up, in the way eyes darted during meetings, checking reactions. He sensed that the system was reaching a breaking point, and he was right. The fall didn't come with a single dramatic collapse. It came in pieces. Arrests, disappearances, rumors of cooperation, whispers that someone had talked, or might talk, or could be forced to talk. In that climate, fear didn't just sharpen people. It broke them. The man who had driven the expansion suddenly became a liability. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded too loudly. His name carried weight, but it also carried attention. And attention, once it becomes uncomfortable, turns poisonous. Decisions were made quietly. Not about him yet. About damage control. About narrowing exposure. About cutting anything that couldn't be defended. The crew didn't turn on him immediately. They adjusted around him, letting him absorb pressure while others stepped back. For the man caught nearby, this was the worst possible position. Too close to step away cleanly. Too far from the center to control outcomes. He had become collateral without realizing it. He tried to distance himself. Subtly. Less involvement. Fewer appearances. But absence in this phase looked like fear. And fear was contagious. It suggested instability. People began reassessing him through a harsher lens. Not because he had changed, but because the environment had. Under pressure, tolerance evaporates. Traits once considered manageable become unacceptable. Questions grow sharper. Is he steady? Is he rattled? Does he know too much? We hold if squeezed. These questions didn't need answers. The act of asking them was enough. The man who had brought the heat sensed the shift too late. His instincts, once sharp, dulled by overconfidence. He pushed when he should have paused, pressed when he should have retreated. That only accelerated the backlash. When he finally fell, it wasn't with a bang. It was with paperwork, indictments, courtrooms, silence. The spectacle ended not in violence, but in exposure. And once exposed, the system moved quickly to protect itself. With him gone, the crew needed stability. They needed quiet. They needed to erase the echoes of his chaos. That meant reevaluating everyone who had been close to the heat. Everyone whose name might still attract attention. The man who had once been valued for his restraint now found that restraint wasn't enough. His proximity had marked him. Not guilty by action, but by association. In this world, that distinction didn't matter. He felt the walls closing in without seeing them move. The conversations that never happened. The calls that went unanswered. The invitations that stopped coming. These weren't punishments. They were signals. And signals, once ignored, become sentences. The myth would later simplify all of this. Reduce it to personalities and tempers. To loud men and loud endings. But the truth was quieter. More procedural. More chilling. The temperature had been raised. And once raised, it never returned to what it had been before. The crew was changing. The rules were tightening. And somewhere in the tightening space between caution and fear, a decision was beginning to form. Not yet spoken, not yet acted on, but inevitable all the same. Chapter 5. Loose Cannons and Silent Sentences. It always starts with a look. Not anger, not fear, just recognition. The moment when a room collectively realizes someone has become unpredictable. In this world, unpredictability isn't exciting. It's terminal, because chaos doesn't just threaten enemies. It threatens structure. And structure is the only thing keeping the entire machine from collapsing under its own weight. The men who lasted the longest understood this better than anyone. They didn't confuse bravery with recklessness. They didn't mistake aggression for strength. They knew the difference between pressure and panic, between control and impulse. And they watched closely when someone started slipping from one category into the other. The crews were full of personalities that needed managing. Always had been. Some men drank too much. Some talked too freely when they thought the room was safe. Some carried old grudges that never quite healed. These flaws were tolerated as long as they stayed predictable. Predictability made risk measurable, and measurable risk could be managed. But every so often, a man crossed an invisible line, not with a single act, but with accumulation. Too many late nights, too many emotional swings, too many moments where his reactions felt slightly off. The kind of off that made others uncomfortable without being able to explain why. Those men earned a nickname they never heard spoken aloud. Loose cannon. It didn't mean violent all the time. It meant unreliable under pressure. It meant a variable that couldn't be controlled. And in a system built entirely on control, that was unforgivable. The tragedy was that most loose cannons didn't see themselves that way. They saw themselves as passionate, as committed, as men who cared deeply about respect and loyalty. They believed their intensity proved their value, that their willingness to react meant they were serious. But seriousness in this world didn't look like emotion. It looked like restraint. The man at the center of this story was walking a narrowing path, not because he wanted to be dangerous, but because the environment was squeezing him from all sides. Pressure came from above and below. Expectations rose while trust thinned. Every move he made was watched more closely than before. He felt it. The constant evaluation, the sense that he was being weighed and found lacking in ways no one would articulate. That kind of pressure does something to a person. It makes them hyper-aware, defensive. It pushes them toward overcorrection. Overcorrection is fatal here. He began reacting faster, speaking more sharply, pushing back where he once absorbed. These weren't dramatic changes. They were subtle, almost imperceptible to outsiders. But to men trained to read behavior like body language, they stood out immediately. A pause that came too late, a laugh that felt forced, a response that carried more edge than necessary. These were small things, but small things were everything. The crew didn't confront him. Confrontation created friction. Friction created attention. Instead, they observed, cataloged, compared notes without writing anything down. Each man forming his own quiet conclusion, then checking it against the reactions of others. This was how sentences were passed, not in rooms with raised voices, but in silence shared between men who already understood the stakes. Loose cannons didn't need to betray anyone to become liabilities. They just needed to look like they might. In an era of informants and wiretaps, potential mattered as much as proof. Fear wasn't about what had happened. It was about what could. And fear, once it took hold, reshaped perception. The man tried to steady himself. He told himself he was imagining it. That stress was normal. That everyone felt watched. Which was true. But not everyone was being reassessed. He leaned harder into his role. Took on more responsibility. Inserted himself where he wasn't asked. Believing initiative would remind people of his usefulness. But initiative without invitation looked like desperation. And desperation was another red flag. Men began creating distance. Nothing obvious. Just a step back. A slight delay in returning calls. A tendency to include others in conversations that once would have been private. This wasn't punishment. It was insulation. Insulation keeps damage from spreading. The cruel irony is that the more isolated he became, the more intense he felt inside. And the more intense he felt, the more visible that intensity became. It was a feedback loop with no escape. He watched other men navigate the same pressures with smoother edges. Men who could swallow frustration and project calm even when they were boiling internally. He tried to emulate them, but the effort itself showed. Control that feels forced never convinces anyone. There were moments when he sensed what was happening. Flashes of clarity late at night, alone, when the noise of the day finally faded. Moments where he considered stepping back entirely. Disappearing. Creating distance on his own terms. But disappearing without permission was dangerous too. Absence could be interpreted as fear, or worse, preparation. In this world, if someone started pulling away suddenly, the assumption wasn't relief. It was suspicion. So he stayed. The crew's tolerance continued to erode. Not because he did something wrong, but because the environment demanded tighter margins. Law enforcement pressure was relentless. Cases were being built quietly. Old faces were vanishing into courtrooms and prison cells. Every remaining loose end felt heavier. The system didn't have room for doubt anymore. Loose cannons had always existed, but they were easier to absorb when the structure was strong. Now the structure was under strain. That meant anything that rattled it, even slightly, had to be addressed. Addressed didn't always mean killed. Sometimes it meant sidelined. Other times it meant watched. But in cases where uncertainty persisted, where risk couldn't be reduced, the outcome followed a familiar path. The decision-making process was cold, not personal. No vendettas, no anger, just assessment. What does this person cost us? What does removing them cost us? Which cost is lower? These calculations were never spoken in full. Each man filled in the blanks himself. That shared understanding made explicit discussion unnecessary. The man in question became a topic without knowing it. A concern, a contingency, something to be resolved rather than relied upon. That shift, once it happens, is irreversible. He noticed that people stopped sharing information freely around him. That details were withheld. That he was given tasks without context. This was another form of insulation. Keep him useful, but limit exposure. Limited exposure is a prelude. He responded by trying to regain trust, by demonstrating loyalty, by showing he was still solid. But loyalty in this phase didn't reassure anyone. It raised a different concern. Would he remain loyal if pressure increased? Would he break? Would he talk? Talking didn't require malice. Fear was enough. And fear was something everyone felt eventually. The crew had seen men swear eternal loyalty crumble under fluorescent lights and long interrogations. They'd seen tough men fold not because they wanted to, but because the system ground them down piece by piece. No one believed themselves immune anymore. That reality hardened attitudes. Compassion became dangerous. Doubt became disqualifying. The man didn't know when the line was crossed. There was no single moment, no dramatic mistake, just a gradual consensus forming around him, solidifying quietly like concrete setting in the dark. By the time he realized how far things had shifted, his options were already gone. Trust once lost in this world didn't return. It was replaced. He still moved through his days, still showed up, still believed there was time. But the crew had already moved him into a different category in their minds. Not friend, not enemy. Risk. Risk doesn't get second chances. The final cruelty of this system is how ordinary the days remain right up until the end. There's no sense of finality, no ominous soundtrack, just routine, familiar streets, familiar faces, familiar tension humming beneath everything. He didn't know which conversation sealed his fate, or whose nod mattered most, or when exactly the sentence became inevitable. He only knew that something had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. Loose cannons don't explode immediately. They rattle first. And once the rattling becomes audible, the men responsible for maintaining order don't wait to see what happens next. They act, quietly, decisively, without witnesses. The silence that followed him was already forming, stretching outward, preparing to swallow the space he occupied. And soon, very soon, that silence would have a story attached to it. Chapter 6. Hollywood's Lie and the Shape of Fear. The story everyone remembers begins with laughter. Loud, reckless laughter, spilling into a room like it owns the place. That's the version people recognize. The one that feels cinematic. Familiar. Safe, in a strange way. Because it turns something terrifying into something understandable. A character. A role. A warning wrapped in entertainment. But the real story didn't begin that way, and it didn't end that way either. The transformation happened years later, long after the man himself had already vanished into rumor, long after the silence around his name had hardened. Hollywood didn't invent the fear. It reshaped it, smoothed its edges, Gave it a face people could point to and say, that's the guy. That's what happens when you go too far. The problem with that version is how clean it feels. How inevitable. As if the outcome was always destined, written into his personality from the start. As if chaos alone explained everything. That lie made the audience comfortable. Because if recklessness is the cause, then discipline feels like protection. If loud men die loudly, then quiet men must be safe. But that's not how this world works. The truth was messier, more unsettling. The man at the center of this story wasn't undone by volume alone. He was undone by perception, by timing, by the slow, grinding pressure of a system that doesn't forgive ambiguity. Hollywood reduced him to a caricature because nuance doesn't fit neatly into a scene. The real environment didn't reward bravado or punish noise consistently. It punished uncertainty, and uncertainty could come from anywhere. A glance held too long, a reaction too sharp, a silence that felt wrong. The rules weren't moral. They were mechanical. In the film version, fear is external. It arrives suddenly, violently, with clear signals. You know when things have gone wrong. You see the threat. You hear in the dialogue. The audience gets closure. A lesson delivered in a single brutal moment. Real fear doesn't work that way. Real fear creeps in slowly. It's ambient. It fills rooms without announcing itself. It changes how people sit, how they speak, how they decide who gets invited and who doesn't. It doesn't shout. It hums. The man experienced that hum every day without fully understanding where it came from. Hollywood would later suggest he ignored warnings, that he laughed when he should have listened, that he pushed too hard. That version flatters the audience. It suggests survival is about attitude. In reality, survival was about alignment, about being in sync with invisible expectations that shifted constantly. You could do everything right and still fall out of step, and once you did, there was no apology that could bring you back. The movie gave him a definitive personality because audiences need clarity. They need cause and effect. But the real man existed in gray spaces. He wasn't always loud. He wasn't always volatile. He was sometimes cautious, sometimes anxious, sometimes restrained to the point of paralysis. Those contradictions didn't translate well to screen. They didn't offer a clean arc, so they were erased. What remained was a symbol, a shorthand, a warning sign dressed up as entertainment. The frozen truck became the centerpiece because it was visual, memorable, cold in every sense of the word. It told the audience exactly what to think and exactly when to think it. But that image didn't come from evidence. It came from storytelling instinct, from the need to give silence a shape. In real life, silence doesn't freeze. It spreads. The myths serve another purpose too. It protected the system. By focusing on an individual flaw, it deflected attention from structural violence. It suggested the system itself was sound, and only those who misbehaved suffered consequences. That idea is comforting. It implies fairness. The system wasn't fair. It was efficient. Efficiency doesn't care about innocence or guilt. It cares about stability. And stability sometimes require removal. Not punishment. Removal. As if a part had worn down and needed replacing. Hollywood turned that process into a morality play. The man became the lesson. Talk too much, act too wild, and this is what happens. End of story. Fade to black. But in doing so, it erased the most frightening part of all. The randomness. The quiet consensus. The fact that no one ever tells you when you've crossed the line. That realization doesn't sell tickets. It unsettles too deeply. The real fear wasn't the truck. It was the weeks before it. The conversations that stopped mid-sentence. The subtle exclusion. The sense that something had changed, but no one would say what. The awareness that you were being evaluated by people who would never give you feedback. That's the fear that kept men awake at night. Not screaming threats. Not guns. But the idea that you were no longer fully inside the circle, and that no one would explain why. The film showed fear as something imposed. In reality, fear was cultivated, maintained, shared quietly among men who all knew how quickly things could turn. They didn't need reminders. They needed reassurance. And reassurance came from decisive action. The myth also simplified loyalty. On screen, loyalty is emotional, explosive, dramatic. In real life, loyalty was procedural. It meant protecting the structure, not the individual. It meant accepting that removal could be an act of preservation, not betrayal. That's a hard truth to swallow, which is why it was rewritten. The audience was given a villain they could understand, a man whose flaws felt obvious, a fate that felt deserved, closure disguised as justice. But justice had nothing to do with it. The real men who lived through that era didn't see it as justice either. They saw it as maintenance. Necessary, regrettable, unavoidable. Those emotions coexisted. They didn't cancel each other out. Hollywood doesn't like coexistence. It prefers clarity. By reshaping the story, the film also reshaped memory. Younger generations learned the myth first. They absorbed it as truth. Over time, the myth became more real than the man himself. The symbol replaced the person. That replacement was convenient. It meant no one had to ask harder questions about how fear operates in closed systems, about how consensus can kill without violence, about how silence is often the most dangerous weapon of all. The man's disappearance became a punchline in some circles, a cautionary tale in others. Rarely was it treated as a human story. Rarely did anyone ask what it felt like to realize you were no longer safe, without being able to explain why. That feeling is difficult to dramatize. It has no soundtrack, no clear antagonist, just the slow tightening of space around you, until every movement feels watched. The myth flattened all of that, turned complexity into spectacle, made the ending loud, so the middle didn't have to be examined. But if you strip away the performances, the edits, the dialogue written for impact, what remains is far more unsettling. A man who didn't fully understand when he stopped belonging. A system that never announced its decisions. A silence that grew louder than any threat. The frozen truck wasn't the story. It was the punctuation Mark added later. A visual metaphor created to give shape to something invisible. Something colder than ice. Collective withdrawal. Hollywood told us to look at the ending. To gasp. To remember the shock. But the real horror lived earlier. In the waiting. In the uncertainty, in the realization that nothing you did mattered anymore, because the decision had already been made. The myth suggests you can avoid this fate by behaving differently, by being quieter, smarter, more disciplined. The truth is harsher. Sometimes alignment fails, even when behavior doesn't. That's the part the film couldn't afford to tell. Because if the audience understood that, the fear wouldn't end with the credits. It would follow them out of the room. And that fear, unlike the kind Hollywood sells, doesn't need a freezer to survive. It just needs silence. By the time the myth was complete, the man was long gone, reduced to a lesson, a caricature, a single frozen image meant to stand in for years of pressure, doubt, and quiet calculation. But beneath that image, the real story continued to whisper, not about recklessness, not about punishment, but about how systems decide who belongs, and how they remove those who no longer fit. The audience never hears that whisper. They just remember the laugh, and miss the warning hidden underneath it. Chapter 7, Paranoia becomes policy. It didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with glances, with pauses that lasted half a second longer than they used to, with voices lowering instinctively, even when there was no one new in the room. Paranoia didn't explode into existence. It settled in. Slowly, like dust you don't notice until it coats everything. By the time anyone acknowledged it out loud, it was already policy. The streets hadn't changed. The buildings were the same. The social clubs still opened their doors at the same hours. Coffee was poured. Cards were shuffled. Jokes were told. But beneath the routine, something fundamental had shifted. Trust, once rare but real, had thinned almost nothing. Every interaction, now, carried an extra layer of calculation. Men stopped speaking freely, even among friends. Not because they suspected betrayal, but because certainty no longer existed. It wasn't about who was wired or who was talking. It was about not knowing. And not knowing was unbearable. Law enforcement pressure didn't need to be visible to be effective. Just the suggestion of it was enough. An arrest here, a subpoena there, A rumor that someone had been seen entering a federal building. None of it confirmed. All of it corrosive. The system adapted the way it always did. Not by fighting the pressure directly, but by tightening inward. Fewer people were trusted. Fewer details were shared. Responsibilities were compartmentalized. Knowledge became dangerous. The man at the center of this story felt a change in his body before he understood it intellectually. A tension that never quite released. Sleep that came in fragments. A sense that every word spoken might be the wrong one, even when it wasn't. He began replaying conversations in his head after they ended, analyzing tone, reconstructing facial expressions, wondering whether a joke had landed wrong, whether silence had said too much. That kind of self-surveillance is exhausting. It wears people down, and worn-down people make mistakes. The irony was cruel. The more careful he tried to be, the more unnatural he seemed. Silence, once a strength, began to feel loaded. Others wondered what he was thinking, what he might be hiding. In a climate of paranoia, neutrality didn't exist. The crew didn't say the word paranoia. That would have implied weakness. They called it being smart, being cautious, being realistic. Those were acceptable terms, necessary ones. Meetings grew smaller. Sometimes they didn't happen at all. Decisions were made through intermediaries. Messages passed indirectly. Each layer added distance, and with distance came distortion. Intentions blurred. Assumptions multiplied. Men started carrying fear differently. Some masked it with bravado. Others withdrew completely. A few leaned into aggression, believing intimidation might keep threats at bay. None of these strategies worked consistently. Paranoia has a way of leveling personality. The man watched others unravel in subtle ways. Someone drinking more than usual. Someone snapping at a harmless comment. Someone suddenly obsessed with loyalty, demanding reassurance no one could give. These were warning signs, but no one wanted to acknowledge them. Acknowledgement meant vulnerability. He wondered if others saw the same signs in him. The fear of being perceived as unstable became its own form of instability. Every attempt to project calm felt forced. Every attempt to appear unaffected invited scrutiny. It was like trying to stand still on a moving train. The crew's priorities shifted. Where once ambition had driven decisions, now containment did. The question wasn't how much could be gained, but how much could be lost. Risk tolerance collapsed inward. Anything that couldn't be controlled tightly enough was reconsidered. Men who had once been assets became questions. Questions became concerns. Concerns became plans. This wasn't personal. That was the most disturbing part. The system didn't need anger to function. It only needed logic. Cold, unyielding logic that treated human beings like variables. The man tried to anticipate what the system wanted from him, to adjust preemptively. But the system didn't communicate its expectations anymore. Communication was itself a risk. Clarity gave way to ambiguity, and ambiguity gave cover to decisive action. He noticed how certain names stopped being mentioned entirely, not even in whispers, as if silence could erase them retroactively. Those absences spoke louder than any warning ever could. He wondered when his own name would join them. Paranoia changed how time felt. Days stretched. Weeks blurred. Every morning brought the same question. Is today different? And every night ended without an answer. That uncertainty gnawed at him, hollowing out confidence piece by piece. He began to feel watched even when he wasn't. Not by law enforcement, by his own people. The glances, the careful neutrality, the lack of warmth where warmth used to exist. It wasn't hostility. It was assessment. Assessment has no emotion. It just measures. In this environment, loyalty became abstract, no longer about relationships, but about outcomes. Protecting the structure mattered more than protecting individuals. That logic made sense on paper. In practice, it turned everyone into a potential sacrifice. The man understood this intellectually. He had lived in the system long enough to know how it worked. But understanding didn't make it easier to accept, especially when the math began to include him. He tried to remind himself that paranoia cut both ways, that others were just as afraid, that their distance wasn't judgment, but self-preservation. That knowledge offered little comfort, because self-preservation rarely considers collateral damage. There were moments when he considered leaving town, not disappearing completely, just creating space, letting the pressure settle. But movement itself was suspicious. Sudden travel raised questions. Questions invited attention. Staying put felt dangerous. Leaving felt worse. This is how paranoia traps you. It removes all good options, then punishes you for hesitating. The crew's internal logic hardened further. They began to operate on worst-case assumptions. If someone could be a problem, they treated them as one. If someone might talk, they planned as if they already had. This wasn't cruelty. It was risk management taken to its extreme. Under that framework, innocence was irrelevant. So was intention. The man sensed that the window for correction had closed. There was no single action that could restore trust now. Trust required time, and time was exactly what the system no longer felt it had. Everything accelerated. Not visibly, but internally. Decisions that once took months now took weeks. Weeks compressed into days. The pace of judgment quickened, even as surface routines remained unchanged. That contrast was unsettling. Normalcy on the outside, triage on the inside. He noticed how people avoided prolonged eye contact, how conversations ended abruptly, how certain topics were never broached. These weren't signs of anger. They were signs of conclusion. Paranoia had become policy, not written, not spoken, but enforced through behavior, through exclusion, through silence. Silence was safer than reassurance. Silence couldn't be misinterpreted. Silence didn't leave evidence. The man wondered if anyone would warn him if the worst was coming. He knew the answer before he finished asking the question. Warnings created risk. Risk was what they were trying to eliminate. The system didn't believe in mercy. It believed in efficiency. He found himself thinking about the past more often, about earlier days when fear existed but hadn't dominated every decision, when loyalty still meant something tangible, when mistakes could be corrected instead of erased. Those memories felt distant now, almost fictional, like scenes from a different life. Paranoia doesn't just change behavior. It changes memory. It reframes the past to justify the present. Old friendships are reinterpreted as potential liabilities. Past loyalty is reassessed as possible leverage. Nothing remains untouched. The man could feel the story narrowing around him. Possibilities closing. Conversations shrinking. Space disappearing. Not physically but socially. Emotionally. Structurally. He didn't know when the final decision would be made, or if it already had been. In some ways, that uncertainty was worse than certainty. It meant every day could be the last ordinary one. And yet, life continued. Trucks drove by. People laughed in bars. Children played on sidewalks. The world didn't pause to acknowledge the internal collapse of a hidden system. That indifference made it all feel surreal. Paranoia thrives in that contrast, in the gap between how things look and how they actually are. It feeds on normalcy while hollowing it out from the inside. The man woke up one morning with the same sense of unease he'd felt for weeks. Nothing had changed, and that, more than anything, frightened him. Because when paranoia becomes policy, change doesn't announce itself. It just happens, quietly. And once it does, there's no appeal process, only silence. And somewhere in that silence, a decision was waiting to surface. Chapter 8. The Heist That Changed Everything. It began as a whisper, not excitement, not celebration, just a word passed carefully from one mouth to another, always behind closed doors, always without detail. The kind of whisper that doesn't ask for permission, the kind that rearranges futures before anyone realizes what's happening. This wasn't just another score. Everyone felt that immediately. This was something heavier, something that would tilt the ground beneath them, whether they touched it or not. The city didn't know it yet, but the balance was already shifting. In this world, most operations came and went quietly. Trucks disappeared. Cash changed hands. Things were stolen and replaced without anyone outside the circle ever noticing. But once in a generation, something emerged that was too big to stay contained, too profitable to remain small, too tempting to handle carefully. And when that happened, it didn't just reward ambition. It punished proximity. The idea alone carried weight. not because of its complexity, but because of its scale. The numbers were almost abstract, so large they stopped feeling real. Men who had spent their lives counting bills suddenly struggled to picture the total. When money becomes unimaginable, it stops being just money. It becomes power, and power changes behavior. The crew felt it immediately. Conversations grew sharper. Voices dropped lower. The usual caution didn't disappear, but it bent under the promise of something unprecedented. A single move that could rewrite hierarchies. That could buy distance from fear. That could end worries permanently. At least, that's how it was sold. The man at the center of this story wasn't at the core of the plan. That distinction mattered more than he realized. He was close enough to feel the heat, but not close enough to control it. Close enough to be associated, but not close enough to benefit fully. That position is the most dangerous place to stand. He watched as the atmosphere changed. Men who once argued over details now brushed concerns aside. Patience evaporated. Doubt was framed as weakness. Anyone who questioned the pace was reminded of what was at stake. This wasn't just opportunity. It was destiny, or so it felt. He sensed the risk immediately, not just from the outside, but from within. Big scores didn't just attract law enforcement. They attracted envy, suspicion, greed. They widened cracks that were already there. And cracks, once widened, don't close again. The planning phase was tense, not because of disagreement, but because of restraint being tested. Everyone knew the rules. Keep it quiet. Keep it contained. Keep it disciplined. But the sheer size of the prize made discipline harder to maintain. The excitement leaked into posture, into tone, into impatience. Men began talking too much, not to outsiders, but to each other, repeating details, revisiting hypotheticals, imagining outcomes. Those conversations left echoes, and echoes linger. The man tried to stay peripheral, observant, careful. He didn't want to be seen as uninterested, but he also didn't want to be seen as overeager. That balance had always served him well. But now the ground was moving too fast beneath his feet. The night the job went down, the city slept like it always did. That's the unsettling part. The most consequential moments rarely announce themselves. No alarms, no sirens. Just routine continuing uninterrupted while something irreversible unfolds. When it was over, the silence felt different, heavier, charged. Men didn't celebrate the way they had after smaller wins. There was no laughter, no relief, just calculation. Everyone understood that the real danger hadn't passed. It had just begun. Success at that scale doesn't close chapters. It opens investigations. The immediate aftermath was euphoric in private and restrained in public. Money moved quickly. Decisions were made faster than usual. Men began repositioning themselves almost instinctively, paying debts, calling in favors, creating buffers. That behavior told its own story. Everyone knew what was coming. Law enforcement didn't need to know everything. They just needed to know enough. A theft of that magnitude couldn't disappear without leaving a shadow. And shadows attract attention. The man felt the temperature spike around him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because the circle of suspicion widened. Anyone even tangentially connected became part of the equation. Guilt by association stopped being a phrase and started being a strategy. The crew's paranoia deepened overnight. Trust, already brittle, fractured further. People began reassessing relationships through a harsher lens. Who knew what? Who had been where? Who might be pressured? Pressure was the key variable. Not loyalty. Not history. Pressure broke everyone eventually. The question wasn't if someone would crack. It was who would crack first. The man understood that math. It terrified him. He noticed how certain men began distancing themselves from the center of the operation, quietly shedding responsibility. Others did the opposite, inserting themselves deeper, believing proximity meant protection. Both strategies carried risk. He tried to stay neutral, but neutrality no longer existed. The system demanded alignment. If you weren't clearly inside, you were potentially outside. And outside was dangerous. Rumors spread fast after the job. Not details, just impressions. That someone was nervous. That someone had been seen talking to the wrong person. that someone was drinking more than usual. These rumors didn't need confirmation. They fed existing fear. The crew began having conversations that would never be recorded. Conversations about exposure, about damage control, about narrowing risk. Names were mentioned and dismissed. Mention again. Wait. The man's name surfaced in these discussions, not because of evidence, but because of proximity and perception. He had been close enough to know too much, not close enough to be indispensable. That imbalance mattered. He felt a shift in how people spoke to him. The warmth drained away. The questions became more pointed. Casual conversations felt like interviews disguised as small talk. He answered carefully, knowing that over-explaining was as dangerous as saying nothing. Every response felt like it could be misinterpreted, and misinterpretation was all anyone needed. The heist had changed the hierarchy. Not officially, but psychologically. Men who once felt secure now felt exposed. Men who once felt small now saw an opening. Ambition resurfaced in quieter, sharper forms. The aftermath created a feeding frenzy, not of celebration, but of calculation. Who stood where now? Who could be cut loose? Who needed to be protected at all costs? Protection wasn't about friendship. It was about insulation. The man realized something deeply unsettling. The score itself didn't matter anymore. The money was already secondary. What mattered was containment, and containment often required subtraction. He wondered if anyone had considered the cost when they first whispered the idea, or if the promise of transformation had drowned out the warnings. Probably the latter. It always was. Big scores don't fail because of execution. They fail because of aftermath. The pressure intensified as weeks passed. Investigations began quietly, as they always do. No dramatic raids. Just questions. Subpoenas. Men disappearing into offices and re-emerging changed. Each development tightened the noose, not around one person, but around everyone. The system responded by contracting further. Fewer people in the know, fewer conversations, more isolation. Isolation breeds fear. Fear breeds mistakes. The man felt his margin evaporating. The qualities that once made him valuable now felt insufficient. He wasn't loud enough to dominate, not invisible enough to disappear. He existed in an uncomfortable middle space the system no longer tolerated. He thought about leaving. Again, the idea surfaced more often now. But leaving after a score of this magnitude looked like flight, and flight suggested guilt. So he stayed. The heist had accomplished what no amount of law enforcement pressure had managed alone. It turned everyone inward, suspicious, defensive, ready to sacrifice stability for survival. The machine was eating itself, slowly, methodically. The man didn't know when the final calculation would be made, or who would make it, or whether it had already been made and simply not delivered yet. He only knew that the world he had learned to navigate had changed shape overnight. The landmarks were gone, the rules rewritten, the safety margins erased. The whisper that had started it all still echoed, not in words, but in consequences. Consequences that moved silently through the system, rearranging lives. The score that was supposed to end fear had only concentrated it. And in that concentrated pressure, something was about to break. Not loudly, not publicly, but decisively. And when it did, the man would finally understand what proximity to history really costs. Chapter 9. The Night He Vanished. The last night didn't feel like an ending. That's what makes it so disturbing. There was no sense of finality in the air, no cinematic warning, no internal alarm screaming that something irreversible was about to happen. It felt ordinary, familiar, almost comforting in its routine. And that was the most dangerous part of all. He moved through the evening the same way he had moved through dozens before it. Same streets, same buildings, same faces that nodded without warmth or hostility. Just acknowledgement. The city didn't flinch. Brooklyn had seen too much to react to one more man walking its sidewalks. Inside him, though, something was unsettled. Not panic, not fear in the traditional sense. It was the quiet awareness that his margins had disappeared, that every interaction now felt weighted, that every step forward closed another door behind him. He had noticed the silence earlier that day. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of information. No calls, no updates, no small talk that led nowhere. The kind of silence that feels intentional, curated. He understood enough to know that silence was rarely accidental. Still, he told himself what men in his position always tell themselves. That this was temporary, that things would stabilize. That paranoia burned hot and then cooled. That loyalty, once proven, would reassert itself. Belief is a powerful anesthetic. The meeting, if it could be called that, wasn't scheduled. It never would have been. It came wrapped in casual language. A suggestion, a favor, a reason to get into a car without thinking too hard about why. Nothing that raised an obvious red flag. Nothing that felt like a trap. Traps don't announce themselves. They feel like routine. He hesitated for a moment, just long enough for the thought to surface. Should I go? That hesitation mattered more than he realized. But hesitation didn't stop him. Stopping would have raised questions. Questions he couldn't afford. So he went. The car smelled like old upholstery and cigarettes. The driver didn't say much. That wasn't unusual. Silence was often preferred. Conversation created risk. He stared out the window as familiar streets slid past, watching storefronts close for the night, watching lights flicker on in apartments where people were settling into ordinary lives. That contrast struck him, the normality of it all. Somewhere, someone was making dinner. Somewhere else, a television murmured in the background. The world continued uninterrupted, unaware that a decision was unfolding quietly in its midst. He thought about the heist, about how everything seemed to trace back to that moment. Not because of the money, but because of what it revealed. The fragility, the greed, the fear. It had peeled the system open, exposing nerves everyone pretended weren't there. He wondered if anyone would remember him tomorrow, or if his absence would be absorbed the way so many others had been. Briefly noticed, quickly explained away, eventually forgotten. The car slowed, turned, stopped somewhere unremarkable. That too was intentional. Nothing about this world happened in dramatic locations. Drama attracted witnesses. Witnesses created problems. He stepped out. The air felt colder than it should have. Or maybe he was imagining it. The building looked ordinary. Industrial. The kind of place you'd never remember if you drove past it again. That anonymity was part of the design. Inside, the atmosphere was different. Still quiet, but heavier. Charged, like a room holding its breath. He sensed it immediately, the way animals sense changes in weather. Something had shifted. Something final. He didn't ask questions. Asking would have been pointless. He had learned that much. Instead, he waited. That was his instinct. To wait. To read the room. To adjust. But this room wasn't meant to be read. It was meant to be closed. The conversations that sealed his fate had already happened elsewhere. In places he wasn't invited to. In tones so calm, they could have been mistaken for boredom. The decision wasn't fueled by anger or fear. It was fueled by resolution. He was no longer being evaluated. He had already been assessed. There is a moment, sometimes, when a person realizes they are no longer participating in events, but being carried by them. A moment when agency evaporates, replaced by inevitability. He felt that now, though he couldn't articulate it. What followed wasn't violent in the way movies depict violence. There was no struggle worth remembering. No chaos. No raised voices. Efficiency has no need for spectacle. The point wasn't punishment. It was removal. And removal leaves no witnesses. Afterward, the system adjusted immediately. It always does. People noticed his absence. Of course they did. But absence in this world didn't provoke alarm. It provoked explanation, rationalization, stories designed to close the gap without reopening fear. Someone said he'd left town. Someone else said he'd gotten nervous. Another suggested he was laying low. All of these explanations were plausible. That's why they worked. The truth didn't need to be convincing. It just needed to be sufficient. Days passed, then weeks. His name came up less and less. When it did, it was quickly redirected. No one lingered. Lingering was dangerous. Rumors, however, have a way of surviving where facts don't. The story of his end began circulating quietly. Not immediately. These things take time. First as vague references, then as hints, eventually as something more concrete. A truck, cold air, stillness. The image crystallized gradually, shaped by fear and imagination more than evidence. It was a story that felt right, a story that matched the mood of the time. It gave form to something invisible. No one ever confirmed it. Confirmation wasn't necessary. In fact, it would have been counterproductive. Ambiguity kept the story alive. Ambiguity kept the fear useful. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. He vanished because the system decided it was safer without him. Not because he was guilty of a specific act. Not because he betrayed anyone. But because uncertainty had attached itself to his name, and uncertainty could not be tolerated. That's how disappearances work in this world. They are not emotional. They are administrative. The men who made the decision didn't celebrate. They didn't mourn either. They moved on. They had families, businesses, other problems to solve. The system demanded forward motion. Life resumed its rhythm. Meetings continued. Money flowed. New concerns replaced old ones. The absence was absorbed like water in a concrete. But the story lingered. It lingered because stories serve a purpose. They teach. They warn. They shape behavior. The image of a man frozen in silence, locked away from the world, became a shorthand lesson. Don't talk too much. Don't attract attention. Don't become unpredictable. Don't let fear show. The irony is that he had tried to follow those rules. He had believed in them. And still, they hadn't saved him. That's the part no one liked to discuss. His disappearance didn't restore peace. It didn't erase paranoia. It merely shifted it. The system felt temporarily lighter, but the pressure remained. Fear doesn't vanish when it consumes someone. It spreads. It looked for the next place to settle. Some men slept better afterward. Others slept worse. Everyone pretended it was the former. Hollywood would later give the story a clean ending. A single moment of shock. A definitive image that suggested closure. But closure never existed. Only continuation. The real ending was quieter. A man didn't come home. His phone stopped ringing. His place in the world was filled by someone else. And the city kept breathing. Somewhere, a truck drove by unnoticed. Somewhere else, a door closed and never reopened. Somewhere, a memory was rewritten to make sense of what had happened. The night he vanished became just another night in the city's long memory. But the echo of it remained, vibrating beneath the surface, reminding everyone who knew the truth of one essential fact. In this world, disappearance is not an accident. It is a decision, and once made, it cannot be undone. Chapter 10. The Frozen Truck Myth. The story didn't surface right away. It never does. Truth moves slowly in this world, but rumor moves at the speed of fear. At first, there was only absence, then speculation, then, eventually, an image so vivid it began to feel real, even to people who knew better. A truck, steel walls, freezing air, a body left behind like a message no one needed to read twice. That image became the ending everyone remembered, not because it was proven, but because it felt right. In a system built on silence, people crave conclusions. Disappearance without explanation creates anxiety. Anxiety demands narrative. And when no facts are available, the mind fills the gap with something concrete, something cold, something final. The frozen truck story answered a question no one wanted to ask out loud. What happens when you cross the line? It offered clarity in a world that rarely provided it. The specifics didn't matter. The symbolism did. Cold is unforgiving. It preserves. It immobilizes. It stops decay but also stops movement. In the collective imagination, it was perfect. A punishment that matched the crime people believed he must have committed, even if they couldn't articulate what that crime was. The problem was, no one could ever trace the story back to its source. There was no witness, no report, no physical evidence, just repetition. One person heard from another, who heard it from someone else, who swore they knew a guy who knew a guy. That's how myths are born, not from lies, but from needs. The need here was reassurance. The reassurance that the system still worked. That mistakes were corrected decisively. That fear had a shape and an endpoint. The frozen truck gave people something to point to, something to remember. But memory is not accuracy, and repetition does not equal truth. Those who understood how removals actually happened knew the story was too neat, too theatrical, too exposed. A frozen truck implies visibility, discovery, risk. It assumes someone wanted the body found. That assumption doesn't hold up under scrutiny. This world doesn't send messages that way. Messages create attention. Attention invites questions. Questions invite investigations. The real objective is not intimidation. It's erasure. Erasure leaves no symbols behind. The frozen truck myth persisted anyway, because it wasn't meant for the people inside the system. It was meant for the people hovering at the edges. Associates, wannabes, men who needed a reason to stay quiet, men who didn't understand the subtler language of exclusion and disappearance. For them, the image was effective. It frightened. It simplified. It reduced complexity to a single, unforgettable lesson. Inside the system, reactions were more restrained. Some dismissed it outright. Others let it circulate without comment. No one corrected it. Correcting it would have required engagement. Engagement created risk. Silence, once again, did the work. Over time, the myth grew sharper. Details were added. The truck became more specific. The circumstances more elaborate. Each retelling polished the image, stripping away uncertainty and replacing it with confidence. That confidence was contagious. Eventually, people stopped questioning it. The story became accepted not because it was verified, but because it was repeated often enough to feel inevitable. Hollywood would later seize on that inevitability. It needed an ending that hit hard. Something visual. Something the audience could carry with them. The frozen truck was perfect. It felt brutal, poetic, and final. What wasn't was factual. There was never a recover body. Never an official cause of death. Never a paper trail that supported the image people clung to. Just absence. And absence is uncomfortable. The truth is harder to dramatize. It doesn't lend itself to a single scene. It's procedural, quiet, boring even, and that makes it terrifying. The real story likely involved planning, timing, and efficiency. A controlled environment. Minimal exposure. No witnesses. No aftermath. No trace. That kind of ending doesn't linger visually. It lingers psychologically. But psychology doesn't sell as well as spectacle. The frozen truck myth also served another purpose. It shifted responsibility. By framing the ending as punishment for recklessness, it implied moral logic, cause and effect. It reassured people that the system was reactive, not arbitrary. That reassurance was false. The system didn't punish recklessness consistently. It tolerated it when useful and eliminated it when inconvenient. The criteria weren't moral. They were strategic. By accepting the myth, people avoided confronting that reality. The man himself became secondary to the story told about him. His personality flattened. His doubts erased. His caution forgotten. He became a symbol rather than a person. Symbols don't require empathy. That was another reason the myth survived. It made it easier to talk about what happened without acknowledging the human cost, without considering how many small decisions, misunderstandings, and shifting perceptions had led to the final outcome. The frozen truck was an ending people could digest. The real ending was too diffuse, too unsettling. Some insiders quietly mocked the story, not because they found it amusing, but because they recognized it as fiction. They knew how things were handled. They knew the risks involved in leaving a body anywhere it could be found. But they didn't correct the record. There was no incentive to. The myth did its job. It reinforced silence. It discouraged questions. It kept people cautious. In that sense, the myth was useful, even if it wasn't true. Over time, the image detached entirely from the man. It became a standalone warning, repeated in different contexts, applied to different people. The specifics blurred. The lesson remained. That's how folklore works in closed systems. Stories aren't preserved for accuracy. They're preserved for function. The frozen truck functioned as a boundary marker. Cross this line, and this is what happens. Don't ask which line. Don't ask how it's enforced. Just remember the image. But images lie. The real danger wasn't freezing temperatures or locked doors. It was consensus. quiet agreement. The moment when enough people decided someone was no longer worth the risk. That decision didn't require cruelty. It required convenience. The myth also distracted from another uncomfortable truth, that many people had benefited from his removal. Stability returned. Pressure eased. Attention shifted elsewhere. Life went on, acknowledging that reality would have forced people to confront their own complicity. The myth absolved them. It turned the event into a morality tale instead of a structural one. He became the example. Everyone else remained blameless. The longer the story circulated, the harder it became to challenge. New generations learned it as fact. They repeated it without questioning where it came from. The frozen truck became synonymous with his name, inseparable from it. At some point, challenging the myth felt like denying reality. Even without evidence, the image had become too ingrained to dislodge. That's the power of narrative. It doesn't need proof. It needs resonance. And the frozen truck resonated because it captured something true, even if the details were wrong. It captured the coldness of the system, the finality of removal, the absence of ceremony. But the danger of metaphor is that it replaces inquiry. People stop asking what actually happened. They stop examining the process. They accept the ending and move on. That acceptance allowed the real mechanisms to remain hidden. The man's disappearance didn't end with a dramatic discovery. It ended with paperwork that never existed, with conversations that were never recorded, with decisions that left no fingerprints. That's why the myth filled the void. It gave form to something formless. It gave closure where none existed. But closure is an illusion here. The truth is that his story didn't end in a truck. It ended in a calculation, in a moment when enough people agreed that uncertainty was too expensive to tolerate. Everything else came later. The frozen truck is remembered because it's easy. The real ending is forgotten because it's uncomfortable. And as long as the myth persists, the system that created it remains unexamined. That may have been the point all along. Chapter 11. How bodies vanish without a trace. Disappearance is not chaos. That's the first thing to understand. It's order pretending to be absence. When someone vanishes in this world, it isn't because things spun out of control. It's because control tightened. Quietly, deliberately, with intention that leaves no fingerprints. People imagine panic at the center of these moments. Raised voices, urgent decisions. But the truth is colder. By the time a body disappears, panic has already passed. What remains is procedure. The system had learned long ago that violence alone was sloppy. It created noise. Noise attracted attention. Attention invited scrutiny. And scrutiny was the one thing that could unravel everything. So the system adapted. It evolved away from spectacle and toward invisibility. Erasure became the goal. The city itself helped. New York was dense, layered, constantly rebuilding over itself. Construction sites opened and closed. Foundations were dug. Concrete poured. Trash moved in endless streams through industrial arteries no one ever thought about. If you wanted something gone, the city offered options. Men learned to think in logistics, not emotion. Where does something move? How often? Who notices? Who asks questions? It was less about brutality and more about planning. A body was not a symbol. It was a liability. The most effective removals left no moment to remember. No public scene. No witnesses who could recall details later. Nothing dramatic enough to linger in the mind. Just an absence that could be explained away through time. Time was the greatest ally. The longer someone was missing without incident, the less urgent the question became. People adjusted. Life filled the gap. Memory softened. The man who vanished had become part of that calculation. His removal didn't need to frighten the public. It needed to stabilize the internal environment. That meant doing it in a way that didn't ripple outward. The frozen truck story lingered because it was vivid. But vivid things are risky. Real removals favor the opposite. Mundane locations. Controlled spaces. Places where no one lingered and nothing stood out. Silence wasn't just the result. It was the method. The system relied on participation without acknowledgement. Drivers who didn't ask questions. Workers who did their jobs and went home. Environments where no single person saw the whole picture. Responsibility diffused so thoroughly that guilt never found a place to land. That's how bodies vanish. Not through cruelty alone, but through cooperation. Unspoken, habitual cooperation. People imagine that someone must know the full truth, that there's a single person carrying the secret. But secrets don't survive that way. They fracture. Each participant holds a fragment, so small it doesn't feel like a secret at all. One man drives. Another opens a door. Someone else cleans a space. No one narrates the story. No one needs to. This diffusion protects everyone involved. It also ensures that the truth, even if someone wanted to tell it, could never be reconstructed fully. The man's disappearance followed this logic. Whatever happened, it was designed to end questions, not provoke them. Designed to leave nothing that could be stumbled upon later by accident or curiosity. Bodies are inconvenient. They demand explanations. Explanations require lies. Lies create risk. Absence requires nothing. Absence is clean. The system understood that grief fades faster than curiosity when there's no focal point. Families search at first. Friends ask questions. But without a scene, without evidence, the search loses momentum. Time erodes urgency. Silence fills in the cracks. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was efficiency, a way of ensuring that one problem didn't become many. The man had once believed that loyalty might protect him. That familiarity counted for something. But loyalty operates differently here. It protects the structure, not the individual. When the two conflict, the individual is removed without hesitation. That removal wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as necessity. Necessity dulls conscience. Those who participated didn't see themselves as killers. They saw themselves as custodians, maintaining balance, preventing greater harm. That self-image mattered. It allowed them to continue functioning without fracture. The city absorbed the absence easily. It always does. People move constantly. Faces disappear and reappear. One more missing man didn't disrupt the rhythm. The absence became a blank space others stepped around instinctively. Conversations avoided his name, not because it was forbidden, but because it was unnecessary. Mentioning it served no purpose. Purpose drives memory here. When something stops serving a function, it dissolves. Hollywood struggles with this concept because it lacks drama. There's no final image, no scene to anchor emotion. But that lack is the point. The true terror isn't what you see. It's what you never do. The man's body, wherever it went, stopped maturing almost immediately. What mattered was the effect. The quiet recalibration. The subtle relief. The way tension eased in rooms that had grown tight. That relief confirmed the decision. It validated it retroactively. People felt safer. Stability returned, at least temporarily. That sensation reinforced the logic of removal. Fear didn't vanish, but it redistributed. Shifted away from the structure and onto the lesson. The lesson didn't require explanation. Everyone understood it intuitively. Don't become a question. Questions linger. Questions invite scrutiny. Questions destabilize systems built on controlled uncertainty. The man had become a question. His disappearance answered it. Years later, people would still debate what happened. They would search for the body, for proof, for a definitive explanation. But that search misunderstands the nature of the system. The system doesn't leave evidence. It leaves outcomes. And the outcome here was simple. One less variable. One less risk. One less name that needed managing. The absence became normalized quickly. That's another uncomfortable truth. People adapt faster than they expect. Even a loss. Especially when acknowledging loss carries its own danger. Some nights, someone might have remembered him. A face. A voice. A shared moment. But those memories stayed private. Memory shared is memory that spreads. Spread attracts attention. Attention is expensive. So memory was kept small. Contained. Like everything else. This is how bodies vanish without a trace. Not through extraordinary effort, but through ordinary behavior repeated consistently. Through a city that never stops moving. Through people who know when not to look. The man's story didn't end with a discovery. It ended with adjustment. With the system recalibrating itself to a new equilibrium. And in that equilibrium, There was no place for him anymore. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was maintenance. And maintenance, once completed, leaves no record. Only a gap where something used to be. A gap most people learn to step around. And eventually, forget. Chapter 12. The message everyone understood. The silence that followed his disappearance was not empty. It was full, dense, charged with meaning. In this world, silence is never neutral. It speaks louder than threats ever could. And everyone who mattered heard it immediately. No announcement was made. No explanation offered. There was no meeting where his name was officially erased. That would have been unnecessary. The message didn't need words. It traveled through absence, through behavior, through the sudden recalibration of how people moved and spoke. The first sign was how quickly the system adjusted. Responsibilities were reassigned without discussion. Schedules changed. Routes shifted. People who once worked closely with him found themselves reporting to someone else, as if it had always been that way. Efficiency returned with unsettling speed. That speed was the message. It told everyone watching that the structure was intact, that nothing essential had been damaged, that the machine could lose a part and continue running without hesitation. In some ways, that was more frightening than any act of violence. Men noticed how quickly his name stopped being useful. Not forbidden, just irrelevant. When it came up, conversations moved past it instinctively, like stepping around broken glass without stopping to stare. Lingering was discouraged not by rule, but by instinct. Instinct had been trained carefully over decades. The message was not aimed at outsiders. Outsiders would never hear it clearly. They might notice the absence, but they wouldn't understand what it signified. The message was for the people inside the system, the ones who knew how things really worked. It said this is what happens when uncertainty attaches itself to you. It didn't matter whether the uncertainty was deserved. That detail was irrelevant. What mattered was the effect. The system had no tolerance for unresolved questions. Questions slowed everything down. Questions created friction. The man had become friction. Everyone took note of how clean the removal was, how little disruption it caused. That was intentional. Clean removals reinforce discipline. They remind people that resistance is futile, but compliance is rewarded with continuity. Men adjusted their behavior almost immediately. Voices softened. Jokes became rarer. Conversations tightened. The edges were smoothed. Everyone became more careful, not out of fear alone, but out of respect for the lesson. The lesson wasn't about punishment. It was about alignment. Stay aligned with the system, and the system protects you. Drift out of alignment, and you cease to exist within it. That understanding settled into the collective consciousness quietly. No one needed to explain it. It was already part of the culture. This event merely reinforced it. Some men felt relief. They wouldn't admit it out loud, but they felt safer knowing the variable had been removed. Stability returned, even if it was temporary. In unstable environments, temporary stability feels like luxury. Others felt unease. They recognized how thin the margin had become, how little it took to cross from acceptable to expendable. That unease made them more cautious, more withdrawn. Both reactions served the same purpose. The message reshaped relationships. People reassessed who they spent time with, who they were seen talking to, who they trusted with information. Social circles contracted inward. Exposure was minimized. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was discipline. Men who had once been talkative became reserved. Men who had once been visible made themselves scarce. Everyone recalibrated their public face to project reliability, stability, predictability. Predictability became the highest virtue. The irony was that predictability didn't mean obedience alone. It meant emotional control, reaction management, knowing when to disappear without being asked. The man's disappearance taught everyone how not to draw attention, not by example, but by absence. Absence is the most effective teacher. You don't learn what he did wrong. You learn what he failed to be. The system didn't want loud loyalty. It wanted quiet compliance. Loud loyalty invites scrutiny. Quiet compliance blends in. That distinction mattered now more than ever. Law enforcement pressure continued, of course. It always did. But the system was better insulated now. Fewer leaks, fewer loose ends, fewer personalities that might attract attention. From the outside, nothing looked different. From the inside, everything had shifted. Men stopped romanticizing the life. Not openly. That would have been dangerous. But internally, illusions cracked. The cost was clearer now. The margin thinner. Some men reconsidered their ambitions. Not enough to leave, but enough to temper their expectations. Expansion felt risky. Consolidation felt safer. The message encouraged caution over growth. This had long-term consequences. The system grew quieter, less flashy, less visible. It survived not by dominating headlines, but by avoiding them. That survival came at a human cost that was never tallied. The man's family felt the absence differently. For them, there was no message. Only loss, confusion, questions that would never be answered. The system didn't account for that. It never did. Collateral damage was an accepted variable. People justified this internally by telling themselves it was necessary, that the alternative would have been worse, that protecting the structure protected everyone else. Those rationalizations were never challenged. Challenging them would have required empathy. Empathy complicates efficiency. The message wasn't just about fear. It was about boundaries. It clarified where the invisible lines were drawn, how much latitude existed, how quickly it could be revoked. Men began policing themselves more aggressively, correcting behavior before it drew attention, suppressing frustration, managing appearances. The internal pressure intensified, but it was distributed more evenly. That distribution made it manageable. No one wanted to be the next example. The absence also served as a warning to younger associates watching from the edges. Men who dreamed of respect and recognition. Men who thought proximity to power meant safety. They learned instead that proximity increased risk. That being seen was dangerous. That the safest place was just outside the spotlight. This lesson reshaped aspirations. Fewer men chased visibility. More aimed for obscurity. Obscurity became a strategy. The message didn't need reinforcement. It was self-sustaining. Each time someone adjusted their behavior in response, it echoed outward. Others noticed, imitated. The culture adapted. Years later, people would struggle to explain exactly why things felt different after that moment. They would point to arrests, to trials, to external pressures. But insiders knew the real shift came earlier. It came when a man vanished and the world didn't stop. That realization lingered. The most unsettling part of the message was how reasonable it felt, how logical, how easy it was to accept once you understood the stakes. That acceptance was what allowed the system to continue. Fear alone doesn't sustain systems. Justification does. By framing the disappearance as necessary, people protected themselves psychologically. They avoided confronting the moral implications. They focused on outcomes instead of causes. The message thus served two functions. It disciplined behavior and preserved conscience. No one spoke about it directly. No one needed to. The absence spoke for itself. And absence, in this world, is the loudest language there is. The man's story stopped being about him. It became about everyone else. About how they would behave, what they would risk, what they would avoid. That's how messages work here. They erase the individual and elevate the lesson. The lesson didn't say be careful. It said be invisible. And for a time, everyone listened. But invisibility has its own cost. Because the quieter the system becomes, the harder it is to hear when something goes wrong. And something always does. The message settled into the foundations, waiting, not as a warning, as a rule. Chapter 13. The slow collapse no one admitted. The thing about collapse is that it rarely looks like one. There are no alarms. No single moment where everyone agrees something has failed. Instead, it feels like adjustment, like adaptation, like survival. And by the time anyone realizes what's been lost, the system has already taught them not to miss it. After the disappearance, the machine didn't shatter. It tightened. That tightening created the illusion of strength. Fewer voices, fewer risks, fewer mistakes that could be seen from the outside. From a distance, it looked like discipline had finally won. Inside, something else was happening. Men who once trusted their instincts stopped trusting anything at all. Every decision was second-guessed. Every relationship filtered through caution. Creativity, once a quiet driver of expansion, was replaced by fear of deviation. The system survived, but it did so by hollowing itself out. No one announced this shift. It unfolded organically, shaped by memory and loss. The absence became a reference point, a reminder of how quickly someone could be erased without explanation. That reminder sat in the back of every conversation, influencing tone, pacing, and choice. The older men noticed first, not because they were wiser, but because they remembered how things used to feel. The laughter that wasn't forced, the arguments that didn't carry existential weight, the sense that mistakes could be corrected instead of fatal. Those memories were dangerous. Nostalgia can weaken discipline, so they kept them to themselves. Younger men entered a different world entirely. They never experienced the earlier balance. For them, the Titan system was normal. Silence wasn't oppressive. It was expected. Distance wasn't cold. It was professional. They learned quickly that survival didn't depend on bravery or loyalty. It depended on invisibility, on blending into routines so thoroughly that no one ever thought about you at all. That kind of survival is effective. It's also corrosive. The disappearance had removed a problem, but it had also removed a release valve. Tension had nowhere to go now. It couldn't be expressed openly. It couldn't be resolved through confrontation. It stayed inside, accumulating quietly. Pressure without release changes behavior. Men became rigid, less forgiving, less flexible. Mistakes that once would have been addressed privately were now escalated. Tolerance dropped. Margins shrank. The system began consuming itself in smaller ways. Relationships frayed. Trust eroded further. Not dramatically, subtly, enough that people stopped relying on each other. Collaboration gave way to isolation. Isolation increased vulnerability. Vulnerability attracted scrutiny. Law enforcement pressure continued its slow grind. Not spectacular, not cinematic, just persistent. Files grew thicker. Cases matured. Informants surfaced, not because they wanted to betray anyone, but because fear had narrowed their options. The system responded predictably. More insulation, more compartmentalization, fewer shared risks. Each response made sense in isolation. Together, they created stagnation. Stagnation doesn't look like collapse at first. It looks like stability. Money still moved. Operations still functioned. The surface indicators remained intact. But beneath that surface, ambition had died. Innovation stalled. The willingness to adapt creatively vanished. Everyone was focused on not being the next absence. That focus had consequences. Opportunities were missed. Rivals filled gaps quietly. Territories shrank without anyone noticing until it was too late. The system didn't fail all at once. It reseeded. People justified this internally. Smaller footprint meant less attention. Less attention meant safety. Safety was the priority now, even if it came at the cost of influence. The disappearance had recalibrated values. Survival over growth. Control over ambition. Silence over expression. Those values kept the system alive, but they also guaranteed its eventual decline. The men who had once thrived in risk-heavy environments found themselves constrained. Their skills went unused. Their instincts dulled. Some adapted. Others grew resentful. Resentment is dangerous when it has nowhere to go. It didn't explode. It leaked. Through passive resistance. Through quiet disengagement. Through half-hearted compliance. The system didn't notice immediately because everything still functioned. But function without vitality is a slow death. The absence continued to echo, not as fear, but as reference. Whenever someone considered pushing a boundary, they remembered what had happened. Not just to him, but to anyone who became inconvenient. That memory acted like gravity, pulling everyone inward. The machine became smaller, tighter, quieter. It survived by becoming less of what it once was. No one stood up and declared this a loss. Loss implies mourning. Mourning implies attachment. Attachment is risky. So the shift was framed as evolution, as maturity, as wisdom gained through hard lessons. In some ways, that was true. But evolution doesn't always favor longevity. Sometimes it favors immediate survival at the expense of the future. The men who benefited most from this new order were those who wanted less. Less exposure, less responsibility, less risk. They found comfort in routine. The men who struggled were those who had believed in something bigger. Not romance, not fantasy, just the idea that effort could still be rewarded. That belief had quietly died. Years passed. The disappearance became history. The myth remained, but its emotional charge faded. New problems replaced old ones. New faces entered the system with no memory of how things had once been. They inherited a structure already weakened. Law enforcement didn't need to force a collapse. The system was doing the work itself. Slowly, invisibly. Every precaution taken to avoid attention also limited growth. Every layer of insulation reduced adaptability. Eventually, cases landed not because of dramatic betrayals, but because of accumulated fatigue. Men made mistakes not out of greed, but out of exhaustion. The constant vigilance wore them down. The system that had once prized discipline found itself overwhelmed by it. When indictments came, they weren't shocking. They felt inevitable. The response was muted. No panic, just resignation, a sense that this was always how it would end. Some men went quietly. Others fought. None of it restored what had been lost earlier. The disappearance had been a turning point, not because of who was removed, but because of what his absence taught everyone else. It taught them to shrink. Shrinking kept them alive longer. It also made them easier to dismantle. By the time anyone acknowledged decline, it was too late to reverse. The habits were ingrained. The caution reflexive. The ambition gone. The collapse, when it finally became undeniable, didn't feel like a failure of enforcement. It felt like the natural conclusion of a system that had chosen safety over vitality for too long. And through it all, the absence remained unexamined. Not because it wasn't important, but because examining it would have required confronting uncomfortable truths. That the system had sacrificed adaptability for control. That fear had replaced trust entirely. That removal had become easier than resolution. Those truths were never discussed openly. They didn't need to be. The outcome spoke for itself. The collapse wasn't dramatic enough to become legend. It didn't inspire movies. It inspired paperwork, court dates, quiet endings. But it began earlier. It began the moment silence became policy. The moment invisibility replaced ambition. The moment a system decided that the safest future was a smaller one. And once that decision was made, everything else followed. Not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. Chapter 14. How the story was retold. The retelling didn't happen all at once. It never does. Stories like this don't get rewritten in a single moment. They change slowly, shaped by distance, by convenience, by the quiet agreement that some versions are easier to live with than others. By the time the public version solidified, the original had already faded beyond recovery. At first, there was just silence, then speculation, then fragments. Each fragment carried a different tone depending on who was speaking and who was listening. Some treated it like a warning, others like a joke whispered late at night. Over time, the fragments began to line up, not because they were true, but because they were useful. The system needed a story, not internally. Internally, everyone already understood what had happened well enough to adjust their behavior. The story was for the outside, for the associates hovering at the edges, for the next generation who would never meet the man himself, but would need to understand the boundaries without anyone spelling them out. Stories are how systems teach without speaking. The earliest versions were vague. He disappeared. He got nervous. He crossed the wrong people. None of it specific enough to settle the question. Ambiguity lingered, and ambiguity is dangerous when it lasts too long. It invites curiosity. Curiosity invites digging. So the story sharpened. Details appeared. Not verified ones. Imaginative ones. A location. A method. A final moment that felt definitive. The frozen truck emerged not as fact, but as consensus. A shared image that closed the loop. Once that image existed, It began replacing the truth entirely. People repeated it because repetition made it feel safer. Because repeating the story meant you didn't have to ask questions. You didn't have to examine the system or your place within it. You just accepted the ending and moved on. The man ceased to be a person and became a punchline, a parable, a lesson package for easy consumption. His doubts, his caution, his attempts to adapt all disappeared from memory. Those details complicated the story. They suggested vulnerability. They suggested that what happened could happen to anyone. The retold version removed that discomfort. In the retelling, he was reckless from the beginning. Loud. Out of control. A man who practically demanded his own ending. That framing was comforting. It implied order. It implied fairness. It suggested the system only punished those who deserved it. Reality was less forgiving. But reality doesn't survive retelling well, especially not when there are incentives to smooth its edges. As the years passed, the story detached further from its origin. New listeners had no context for the environment that produced it. They hadn't lived through the pressure, the paranoia, the tightening of margins. All they heard was the ending. Endings without context become myths. Then came the dramatization. Not immediately, but inevitably. Once a story circulates long enough, someone recognizes its potential. Not for truth, but for impact. The frozen image was too good to ignore. Too memorable. Too perfectly symbolic. The dramatized version didn't invent the myth. It canonized it. Once it appeared on screen, the story stopped evolving. Film freezes narrative the way ice freezes motion. Whatever version is captured becomes definitive, regardless of accuracy. Viewers absorb it emotionally, not critically. The image lodges in memory and resists correction. After that, challenging the story felt like challenging reality itself. People who knew better stayed quiet. Some out of habit, some out of self-preservation, others because it no longer mattered. The myth had done its job. The system had already changed. The collapse had already begun. Correcting the record wouldn't bring anything back. So silence continued. And silence, once again, did the work. The retelling also served as distance. By focusing on the spectacle of the ending, it pulled attention away from the process that led there. No one examined the gradual exclusion, the quiet reassessments, the internal calculations that made removal feel inevitable. Those details are uncomfortable because they implicate more than one person. They reveal how collective decisions can erase individuals without a single villain to point to. Myths prefer villains. So the retold story created one. A flawed man undone by his own behavior. A cautionary tale that placed responsibility neatly on the subject instead of the system. That reframing allowed everyone else to remain spectators instead of participants. The man's family became footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Their unanswered questions didn't fit the narrative. Grief complicates clean endings, so it was excluded. The retold version didn't ask how disappearance feels from the inside. It didn't ask what it's like to sense your world narrowing without knowing why. It didn't ask how hope erodes quietly or how trust evaporates without confrontation. Those questions were replaced by spectacle. Over time, the retelling hardened into common knowledge. People repeated it confidently, unaware of how little evidence supported it. Confidence replaced accuracy. Familiarity replaced inquiry. That's how history gets bent. The irony is that the retold story wasn't entirely false. It captured something real about fear, about finality, about the cold logic of removal. But it captured it through metaphor, not fact. The metaphor became the truth because it was easier to digest. The retelling also allowed the system to escape scrutiny long after it had faded. By focusing on an individual's supposed flaws, it distracted from the structural dynamics that produced the outcome. The slow collapse, the paranoia turned policy, the fear-driven contraction. Those dynamics were harder to dramatize. They didn't fit into scenes. They didn't offer catharsis, so they were omitted. The man's story, once retold, no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the audience, to the culture, to the need for cautionary tales that explain away discomfort. He became an example rather than a question. That transformation was the final erasure. Long after his disappearance, people still spoke his name, but they spoke it as shorthand, as reference, as warning, rarely as memory. Memory requires empathy. Empathy requires time. Time is scarce in narratives designed for impact. The retelling didn't just simplify events. It simplified morality. It suggested clear boundaries between smart and foolish, disciplined and reckless, safe and doomed. Reality had never offered those distinctions so cleanly. The real lesson was more unsettling. That systems under pressure sacrifice complexity first. That fear reshapes values. That survival often comes at the expense of humanity. Those lessons didn't make it into the retelling. Instead, the story ended with an image everyone could remember and no one needed to examine. A man frozen in place, trapped by his own choices. The audience nodded. The credits rolled. The discomfort ended. But the truth lingered outside the frame. The truth was that the ending had been decided long before the image appeared. That the outcome wasn't the result of a single flaw, but of a system that had lost its capacity for correction. The retelling concealed that truth by offering closure. Closure is seductive. It convinces us that stories end, that lessons are learned, that order is restored. But some stories don't end. They just get quieter. The man's real story didn't conclude with ice and steel. It concluded with consensus, with absence normalized, with the system continuing forward without acknowledging what it had lost. The retelling gave people permission to stop thinking about it. And that may have been its most powerful function. Because as long as the story remained frozen in myth, the deeper questions stayed buried. Questions about how fear governs behavior, about how silence becomes policy, about how easily people accept narratives that absolve them of responsibility. Those questions never made it into the retold version. They were left behind, waiting for anyone willing to listen past the myth. And very few ever did. By the time the story finished circulating, the truth was no longer accessible. Not because it was hidden, but because it had been replaced by something simpler, something colder, something that fit. And once a story fits, people stop trying to change it. Chapter 15. What really happened and why it still matters. The hardest part about the truth is that it doesn't arrive with relief. There's no release when you finally understand it. No sense of justice restored. No balance corrected. The truth, in this case, simply settles. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Impossible to ignore once you see it clearly. What really happened wasn't a moment. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't ice or steel, or a single act of cruelty frozen in time. What really happened was a process. Slow. Human. Systemic. And that's precisely why it matters. The man didn't die because he laughed too loud or talked too much. He didn't disappear because he was careless or foolish. Those explanations are easy. They offer moral order. They tell us that if we behave correctly, we'll be safe. But safety was never guaranteed here. Only usefulness was. What really happened was that he became uncertain in a system that demanded certainty. He became visible in a system that rewarded invisibility. He became human in a structure that increasingly had no room for humanity. That shift didn't occur overnight. It unfolded across years of pressure, recalibration, fear, and compromise. Each stage made sense on its own. Each adjustment felt necessary. Together, they created an environment where removal felt logical rather than cruel. That's the part people struggle with. The idea that no single villain existed. No singular moment of betrayal. Just a collective decision shaped by survival instinct. The system didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy him. It responded to stress the way closed systems always do. By narrowing. By eliminating variables. By choosing predictability over compassion. Once fear became policy, outcomes stopped being personal. They became administrative. That doesn't make them less violent. It makes them more dangerous. Because administrative violence doesn't look like violence. It looks like paperwork, like silence, like decisions made in rooms you're not invited into. It leaves no crime scene, no evidence, no one to blame. The man's disappearance wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom, a sign of a system under strain, choosing self-preservation over accountability. And that's why his story still matters. It matters because it reveals how easily people accept narratives that simplify discomfort, how quickly myth replaces inquiry, how willingly we trade complexity for closure. The frozen truck myth endured because it absolved everyone else. It made the ending about him, not about the environment that shaped his fate. It turned a structural failure into a personal flaw. Once that happened, the system was no longer under scrutiny. Only the individual was. That reframing allowed the same dynamics to repeat elsewhere, under different names, in different eras, without ever being examined honestly. The truth is less satisfying, but more instructive. He didn't vanish because he was reckless. He vanished because he existed in a system that had stopped tolerating ambiguity. Ambiguity is dangerous to rigid structures. It invites questions. Questions disrupt control. Control, once threatened, responds decisively. That response didn't require hatred. It required consensus. The most chilling realization is how ordinary that consensus was. How calm, how reasonable it felt to the people involved. They weren't monsters. They were managers of risk, operating under constant pressure, understanding that forces us to confront something uncomfortable about power itself. That systems designed to protect their own stability will sacrifice individuals without hesitation, and often without malice. The man's humanity was irrelevant to the calculation. His history, his loyalty, his effort, all secondary to the question of risk. Once he was defined as a risk, the outcome followed naturally. There was no dramatic reckoning afterward, no moment of reflection where the system paused to consider what it had done. It simply moved on. That movement validated the decision. Stability returned. Fear redistributed. Life continued. That continuation is what made the act invisible. And invisibility is the most effective form of violence there is. The story matters because it challenges the way we think about responsibility. It forces us to ask who is accountable when harm is produced collectively, when no single hand delivers the blow, when silence does the work. It also matters because it exposes how myths function, not just as entertainment, but as insulation. They protect us from grappling with deeper truths. They tell us what to remember and what to forget. Remember the image. Forget the process. Forget the warning signs. Forget how easily fear reshapes behavior. Forget how quickly people justify actions they would once have found unthinkable. The man's disappearance wasn't a lesson about recklessness. It was a lesson about conformity, about the cost of existing in a system that equates difference with danger. That lesson extends far beyond this story. It appears in institutions, organizations, governments, and cultures everywhere. Wherever fear replaces trust, wherever silence becomes safer than speech. The system that erased him didn't survive forever. It collapsed, slowly, quietly, exactly the way systems built on fear always do. But by the time it fell, the damage had already been done. Lives had been narrowed, possibilities reduced, humanity traded for control. His story is a reminder that collapse often begins long before anyone admits it's happening, that the signs are subtle, that the real danger isn't chaos, but rigidity. When systems stop adapting through dialogue, they adapt through elimination. That's what really happened, and that's why the ending still unsettles. Because there's no neat resolution, no villain defeated, no justice served, just an understanding that power, when unchecked, doesn't need cruelty to destroy. It only needs silence and agreement. The man didn't get a grave. He didn't get answers. He didn't get remembered as himself. He became an example stripped of context. Reclaiming the truth means restoring that context, acknowledging that he was neither hero nor fool, just a person navigating an environment that punished uncertainty more harshly than wrongdoing. That acknowledgement doesn't redeem the system. It exposes it. And exposure is the one thing such systems fear most. The myth will likely outlive the truth. Myths are resilient. They're easier to repeat, easier to remember, easier to consume. But the truth waits beneath them, quieter, heavier, unchanged. It waits for anyone willing to sit with discomfort, to look past the frozen image and examine the conditions that produced it. Because once you do, the story stops being about one man. It becomes about all of us, about how we respond to fear, about what we sacrifice to feel safe, about how easily we accept silence as order. That's what really happened. Not a spectacle, not a punishment, a decision. And decisions like that never stay in the past. They echo, long after the story fades, long after the myth freezes in place, still whispering, still asking whether we're listening, or just repeating the image and moving on.